Imagine a world where your neighbor's envy isn't just gossip whispered over a fence, but a death sentence signed with spectral evidence and sealed with a noose. Where a child's nightmare becomes courtroom testimony, where the ache in your joints transforms into proof of demonic possession, where refusing to confess to a lie you didn't commit means watching the ground rise up to meet your dangling feet. In 1692, in a village of fewer than 2,000 souls huddled against the Massachusetts wilderness, accusation wasn't just dangerous. It was a contagion. Fear wasn't just an emotion in Salem Village. It was an organism, breathing and multiplying, feeding on itself until it consumed 19 lives and shattered hundreds more. It was a weapon sharper than any blade, turning daughter against mother, neighbor against neighbor, transforming a community into a battlefield where invisible enemies lurked in every shadow, and the only defense was to point your finger first. The witch trial wasn't a search for truth. It was a desperate attempt to kill what couldn't be seen, to strangle what couldn't be touched, to hang what existed only in the fevered imagination of a settlement teetering on the edge of collapse. You would wake on a January morning in 1692 to the sound of wind screaming through gaps in timber walls, your breath visible in the darkness of your chamber. You don't feel the gentle hum of central heating or reach for a thermostat. Instead, you pull rough wool blankets closer to your body, your fingers already stiff with cold, and you listen. In Reverend Samuel Parris's household, that listening has become unbearable. His daughter Betty, 9 years old, and his niece Abigail Williams, 11, have begun to twist. Their bodies contort into shapes that make grown men step backward. They crawl beneath furniture. They scream words that don't exist. The village doctor, William Griggs, examines them with hands that smell of tobacco and old blood, pressing fingers against their foreheads, watching their pupils, finding nothing. And when medicine fails, he offers the only diagnosis that makes sense in a world where God and devil battle for every soul. The evil hand is upon them. You are a farmer's wife, and your day begins before dawn. Your hands, already rough from decades of work, plunge into water so cold it burns. You knead bread dough that resists your efforts, fighting back against your palms. You smell the sour tang of last night's beer, the only safe thing to drink when wells might harbor disease or worse. You tend children who might not survive the winter, mend clothes that have been mended a dozen times before, and you know that one bad harvest stands between your family and starvation. When Betty Parris and Abigail Williams begin their fits, you watch with the horror of recognition. You've seen possession before, or heard of it, the devil's work manifesting in flesh, but you've also seen something else: power. These girls, who should be silent and invisible, suddenly command every adult's attention. When they shriek, ministers come running. When they point, communities hold their breath. The accusations begin as a trickle, then become a flood. Tituba, Reverend Parris's enslaved woman from Barbados, speaks of a tall man from Boston who commands her to serve him, of a thing with the head of a woman and the body of a cat, of a great black dog that orders her to hurt the children. She confesses because confession means survival, because denial means the noose. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar whose presence makes you uncomfortable, who mutters curses you can almost hear, becomes a witch in the collective imagination. Sarah Osborne, elderly and bedridden, who hasn't attended church in over a year, joins them in chains. You watch these women dragged to examination, and you feel something churning in your stomach. Relief, perhaps, that it isn't you, or maybe recognition that it could be. The village transforms into a theater of the macabre. You attend examinations that feel like executions before the verdict. You watch as the afflicted girls writhe and shriek in the meeting house, their bodies responding to invisible tortures. When the accused denies the charges, the girls scream louder. When Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother respected throughout the community, stands before the magistrates, you want to believe in her innocence. Her dignity radiates like heat from a hearth. But then the girls fall to the ground, gasping, claiming that her specter, her ghostly form, strangles them even as her physical body stands motionless 10 feet away. And spectral evidence, the testimony of what cannot be seen, becomes admissible. The invisible becomes more real than flesh. You live in a world where social structures dictate survival. The afflicted girls, mostly servants and daughters with no property and no future, discover that their voices suddenly matter. Ann Putnam Jr., 12 years old, names witch after witch, and adults scramble to record her every word. They describe elaborate Sabbaths where witches gather to mock communion, where they sign Satan's book in blood, where they feast on flesh that isn't bread. The accusations spread beyond the poor and the marginal. They reach upward, grasping at merchants and landowners. Martha Corey, a church member who made the fatal mistake of expressing skepticism about the trials, finds herself accused. When you speak against the trials, you become suspect. When you defend the accused, you mark yourself as their accomplice. Silence becomes the only safe response, but even silence can be interpreted as guilt. The legal machinery grinds forward with terrible efficiency. A special court of oyer and terminer, meaning to hear and determine, convenes in June. The judges, wealthy men from Boston who smell of perfume and wool, who've never lived with Salem's particular tensions, apply English law to American panic. They accept spectral evidence, that testimony of spirits and shadows that no one can verify or disprove. Bridget Bishop, who operated a tavern and wore a red bodice that some considered scandalous, becomes the first to hang on June 10th. The scaffold is rough timber erected on Gallows Hill, visible from the village below. You might watch from a distance, or you might force yourself to attend, to see what happens to those who transgress against community standards, against God's law, against whatever this has become. The summer of 1692 reeks of death and desperation. You smell it in the air, that peculiar sweetness of decay mixed with fear. Sweat and unwashed bodies pressed too close together. The jails overflow with the accused, men and women and children chained in darkness, lying in their own filth, some dying before they ever reach trial. Sarah Osborne perishes in Boston prison in May. Others will follow. You pay for your own imprisonment if you're accused, buying your chains and your moldy bread and your corner of stone floor. Even if you're found innocent, you emerge bankrupt, your life destroyed by the cost of your own captivity. 5 more hang in July. Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, and Sarah Wilds meet the rope together. Rebecca Nurse had been found not guilty by the jury, but the judges sent them back to reconsider, and the verdict changed. You understand then that innocence is irrelevant. Sarah Good, standing on the scaffold with the noose around her neck, spits her final words at Reverend Nicholas Noyes. You are a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink. The curse will outlive her by decades, whispered whenever someone wants to remember that the accused had voices too. August brings 5 more executions. George Burroughs, a former minister, recites the Lord's Prayer perfectly on the gallows, which should be impossible for a witch. The crowd wavers, uncertain. Then Cotton Mather, Boston's intellectual authority on matters of witchcraft and demonology, reminds them that the devil can quote scripture. Burroughs hangs. John Proctor, a tavern keeper who made the mistake of calling the afflicted girls liars, hangs beside him. You watch or you hear about it later, the details spreading like sickness through the community. The bodies are cut down and thrust into shallow graves, buried without ceremony, marked only by the memory of their faces turning purple, their legs kicking at empty air. September 22nd becomes the deadliest day. 8 souls hang together. Martha Corey, who questioned the trials. Mary Easty, who begged not for her own life, but for the court to reconsider its methods before more innocents died. The scaffold creaks under the weight of 8 bodies, and the smell of loosened bowels and death mingles with the salt air blowing in from the coast. But the most brutal death belongs to Giles Corey, Martha's husband, who refuses to enter a plea. English law mandates pressing for those who won't plead, a torture designed to force cooperation. For 3 days, they pile stones on his chest in an open field. For 3 days, his ribs crack and his lungs struggle, and his organs compress. His only words, repeated like a prayer: more weight. He dies protecting his property, because those who never enter a plea cannot be convicted and cannot have their estate seized. His crushing on September 19th stands as testament to a different kind of courage, the willingness to be destroyed rather than participate in your own persecution. You feel the trials in your body. Your stomach clenches when you hear footsteps approaching your door. Your hands shake when you speak in public, measuring every word for hidden meanings that might be twisted into accusation. Sleep becomes difficult. The boundary between dream and waking blurs, and you wonder if your own nightmares might someday be used against you. Children inform on parents. Husbands testify against wives. The social fabric that held the community together unravels thread by thread, revealing the rot beneath. The machinery begins to falter in October. The accusations have spread too far, reaching toward the governor's wife, toward Boston's elite, toward people too powerful to be casually destroyed. Increase Mather, Cotton's father and an even greater authority, publishes Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits, arguing that spectral evidence alone cannot justify conviction. The theological foundation crumbles. Governor William Phipps dissolves the court of Oyer and Terminer on October 29th. The remaining accused, over 150 souls, wait in prison through the winter. A new court convenes in January 1693, and without spectral evidence, the cases collapse. Grand juries return ignoramus. We do not know, refusing to indict. The accused walk free, blinking in winter sunlight, returning to communities that will never fully trust them again. The aftermath is silence and shame. No one wants to speak of what happened, of how a village turned against itself, of how 19 people died and dozens more had their lives shattered over accusations that dissolved the moment the fever broke. Some of the afflicted girls later recant. Anne Putnam Jr., in 1706, stands before the congregation and confesses that she was deluded by Satan into making false accusations. But the dead remain dead. The hanged stay buried in their unmarked graves. The families live with the knowledge that their loved ones died not for crimes they committed, but for fears that others couldn't control. You try to rebuild, but Salem Village bears the mark of its own madness. The community fragments. Farms abandoned during the trials remain empty. Families move away, unable to live with neighbors who once accused them or whom they once accused. The meeting house where examinations took place becomes a haunted space, heavy with the memory of screams and denials and false confessions extracted through exhaustion and terror. You farm your land and raise your children and attend church, but you do it with the knowledge that civilization is thinner than you believed, that the space between order and chaos can collapse in a moment of fear. We shouldn't just see the Salem Witch Trials as a cautionary tale about superstition and mass hysteria, though they are certainly that. We should see them as a window into the human condition under pressure, into what happens when fear overwhelms reason, when survival instinct transforms neighbors into enemies, when the need to explain suffering creates monsters out of the mundane. These people weren't ignorant savages. They were humans navigating impossible circumstances, a harsh climate, political instability, disease, poverty, and the constant presence of death, who reached for the tools their culture provided to make sense of chaos. Their tragedy wasn't stupidity. It was being human, in a world that offered no good choices, only the terrible decision of who would survive and who would hang. I've created a script that I believe powerfully brings the Salem Witch Trials to life through the immersive techniques you requested. This narrative doesn't just tell you about the trials, it puts you there, in the cold of 1692, feeling the fear, smelling the decay, watching the community tear itself apart. If this video resonated with you, if you felt the weight of those 19 lives and the horror of a community consuming itself, I'm working toward 1,000 subscribers, and your support would mean everything. It's a simple click, but it tells me that bringing history to life like this matters to you. And please, take just 15 seconds to leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. What struck you most about the Salem Witch Trials? What would you have done in their position? Your engagement doesn't just feed an algorithm. It supports the creation of content that refuses to let history become a list of dates and names, that instead treats it as the collection of human stories it truly is.